Russia does not trust China. In fact, it's planning all sorts of contingencies against China, even nuclear ones. Welcome to China Uncensored. I'm Chris Chappell. As much as China and Russia talk about friendship, Russia isn't stupid. It knows that China's a threat. Especially since Russia's war with Ukraine and the resulting sanctions from the West have increased Russia's reliance on China and given China greater influence over Central Asia and the Arctic and more. Yes, China is stealing influence in the Arctic from Russia. Russia! It's like a vegan beating a cattle farmer in a chili cook-off. Russia and China have always had a tumultuous relationship, going back to the days of the USSR and Mao. But only now do we know just how far that suspicion went. Recently leaked documents from between 2008 and 2014 show how Russia wargamed a Chinese invasion and laid out a possible criteria for something as major as a nuclear strike on China. Yeah, you heard me. Nuclear strike. Even more evidence that the Fallout universe could soon become our universe. On the bright side, if we're all living in underground bases, then there'd be no more skin cancer. Although I guess technically if we're underground, that wouldn't be a bright side. Both China and Russia tried to play down these reports. China's foreign ministry denied there were any grounds for suspicion of Moscow, saying the threat theory has no market in China and Russia. Meanwhile, a spokesperson for Putin said, "We strongly doubt the leak's authenticity." The war games involved attacks on a fictional Northern Federation by the equally fictitious Dacinia, a southern nation with China's exact geography. In one war game scenario, China pays fake protesters to clash with police in Russia's Far East, then sends saboteurs to covertly attack Russian security infrastructure. Once tensions reach a boiling point, China increases defense production and ominously deploys army units at the border as it accuses Russia of genocide. By the way, China accusing Russia of genocide is like Taco Bell accusing Arby's of causing gastrointestinal distress. I mean, they're right, but come on, you know? Russia also worried about other scenarios, such as China waging war via Kazakhstan, possibly leading to strikes on western Serbia and the Urals, and China weaponizing the Chinese diaspora within Russia, which is understandable since there's been a Chinese influx into Asian Russia. In addition to war games, the leaked documents revealed a surprisingly low potential threshold for nuclear strikes on China. Much lower than Putin's previous statement that Russian nuclear doctrine allowed two possible thresholds for using nuclear weapons: retaliation against a first nuclear strike by an enemy, and if the very existence of Russia as a state comes under threat, even if conventional weapons are used. Putin added that neither of those things were very likely to happen, which is unusual coming from good old saber-rattling Vlad. So how much lower were the nuke criteria in the leaked documents? Well, one scenario allowed the use of a tactical nuclear strike to stop China from advancing with a second wave of invading forces. I guess China's massive population is just that big of a threat. Meanwhile, a separate training presentation for naval officers unrelated to the China war games outlines broader criteria for a potential nuclear strike, including an enemy landing on Russian territory, the defeat of units responsible for securing border areas, or an imminent enemy attack using conventional weapons. Other potential conditions include the destruction of 20% of Russia's strategic ballistic missile submarines, 30% of its nuclear-powered attack submarines, 3 or more cruisers, 3 airfields, or a simultaneously hit on main and reserve coastal command centers. Even though the files were made between 2008 and 2014, experts say that this is still relevant to current Russian military doctrine. But why is Russia mapping out war games with China in the first place? Well, this stems from a fear of Chinese invasion, which is a well-founded fear. I'll tell you why after the break. Welcome back. Russia fears a Chinese invasion, and that is not an unreasonable fear. China lost a bunch of territory to the Russian Tsars in the 19th century, and the CCP wants it back. As recently as 2023, China appeared to validate those fears when it published an official map redefining its borders with its neighbors, including Russia. That map included 8 Russian cities and areas, including Russia's port city of Vladivostok, as part of Chinese territory. But even if China hadn't published that map, Russia knows the CCP's ambitions. China actually fought a war with the Soviet Union in 1969. That conflict started over clashing claims on Damansky Island, also known as Junbao in Mandarin. Chinese soldiers, here seen with their backs to the camera, confronted Soviet soldiers on the island. At the same time, there were clashes along the Ussuri and Amur rivers, as well as Xinjiang. Things got so heated that the Soviet Union and China nearly went to nuclear war. So Vlad wasn't the first Russian leader that threatened to use nukes to solve all his problems. Look, Vlad, you say Xi Jinping is your friend, but you can't hug your friends with nuclear arms. In response to China's attacks, the Soviet Union threatened a nuclear response, including a threat to launch missiles against China's nuclear program in Xinjiang. Now, at first, China didn't take the threat seriously. But then they started hearing that the Soviets were asking communist parties around the world and the US about how they'd react to a preemptive strike on China. China realized that the Soviet Union was dead serious. That's why you see multi-level underground bomb shelters across dozens of Chinese cities, which appear to be every bit as shoddy as everything else made in China, and just as patriotic. Since then, those shelters have become residential homes that people thrive in, probably because the rate of skin cancer is so low. Now that's looking on the not bright side. These threats forced China to the negotiating table to de-escalate tensions. But that doesn't mean it stopped the Chinese interests in Russian territory. There are still people in China who still believe Russia's territory is rightfully theirs. But like the Soviet Union, Russia isn't afraid of using nukes. Even though Russia forged a 2001 friendship treaty with China that included a nuclear no-first strike agreement, Russia isn't taking any chances, hence the war games. But this attitude isn't new for Russia. This is all part of a Russian doctrine that many observers call escalate to de-escalate. When Westerners think of nuclear deterrence, they think of mutually assured destruction, the idea that any use of nuclear weapons would result in retaliation and total annihilation for everybody, and the beginning of the Fallout universe in our universe. The Western idea of deterrence relies on persuading an opponent not to initiate an attack because the perceived benefits wouldn't justify the costs and risks. Russians, however, think of nuclear deterrence very differently. They believe that the way to deter enemies is by using what's called fear inducement, ending conflict by shocking adversaries with early use of nuclear weapons or the threat of doing so. According to William Alberk, a director at the International Institute for Strategic Studies who has worked for NATO and the US Defense Department on arms control, Russians talk about soberizing their adversaries, knocking them out of the drunkenness of their early victories by introducing nuclear weapons. Leave it to Russia to discuss international conflict in terms of intoxication. The best way that they think they can do that is to use what they call a lower dosage of nuclear weapons at a much lower level of combat to prevent escalation. They also probably aren't as afraid of retaliation because nuclear winter might even be more mild than Russian winters. They believe that resorting to nukes to end and win unwinnable conventional conflict is the way to go. This is similar to the Soviet Union's thought process. The Soviets incorporated planning for preemption, not in terms of first use, but to out-escalate the West, through delivering a knockout blow to NATO forces and preventing reinforcement at critical ports and airports. It's kind of like trying to fight Muhammad Ali, Mike Tyson, and Rocky Balboa all at once. You know you'll probably get crushed in a fair fight, but maybe if you can sucker punch them while wearing brass knuckles, they'll be knocked out or too afraid to fight back. And I'm sure they especially wanted to sucker punch Rocky Balboa since he single-handedly ended the Soviet Union by beating Ivan Drago in Rocky IV. Anyway, the Russian approach has taken a cue from the Soviet Union. Alberk says that Russia has done at least some theoretical targeting against targets in South Korea, Iran, Azerbaijan, and North Korea, as well as China. Russia sees nukes not just as deterrence, but as an integral part of its military to make up for its weaknesses compared to the US and its allies. That's why nuclear weapons remain an important part of Russia's surface fleet. Russian missiles, bombs, torpedoes, and other payload delivery systems can swap between conventional and nuclear warheads, despite Russia's promise to remove them in the presidential nuclear initiatives in 1991. Russia continues to test its nuclear-capable missiles in regions bordering China. It's also keeping them aimed at China. And strangely enough, a lot of these systems just so happen to only have the range to strike China. But two can play at that game. I'll tell you more after the break. Welcome back. So China, like Russia, is also a firm believer in escalation as deterrence. According to the PLA Encyclopedia, the definition for a strategy of deterrence is the display of military power or the threat of use of military power in order to compel an opponent to submit. The PLA textbook, The Science of Military Strategy, elaborates on this. In it, Chinese generals Peng Guangqian and Yao Youzhi say deterrence plays two basic roles. One is to dissuade the opponent from doing something through deterrence. The other is to persuade the opponent what ought to be done through deterrence, and both demand the opponent to submit to the deterrer's volition. It's just me, or does this read like the most convoluted, aggressive pissing contest of all time? If you want to see who the bigger man is, just arm wrestle, like an over the top, and get it over with. Hey, look, Stallone caused your problems, now he's offering a solution to fix them. The PLA National Defense University's Military Science Research Department, meanwhile, says one of the purposes of deterrence is to shake the other side's will to resist, and thus seize those interests or benefits that originally would have required conflict in order to obtain them. When it comes to nuclear deterrence, China's all about taking the initiative to start wars, not prevent wars, at the timing of its own choosing with shock and awe, forcing others to capitulate. China's history shows a heavy preference for escalation over de-escalation to bring a conflict to an end, which is scary to think about considering the rate of China's nuclear buildup. The US should keep in mind how Russia and China think when it comes to deterrence. That doesn't mean caving into their demands, but it does pay to know where your enemy is coming from. Given how both Russia and China like saber rattling, I'm not too sure if asking one to stop the other from carrying out a nuclear strike is the best thing to do. That's just asking China to weaponize engagement to make the US feel as though it needs China. And that's a no-win situation for the US. Now, I've got a video I want to show you, but first, China Uncensored wouldn't be possible without viewers like you. YouTube is trying to run us out of business, and we can only afford to pay our staff and keep the lights on with your support on patreon.com/China Uncensored. All it takes is $1 an episode. We make about 18 episodes a month, but if that's too expensive for you, you can also set a monthly limit so you could be giving even just $1 a month. Every bit helps. And as a thank you, I'll answer your questions at the end of these episodes. Today's question comes from longtime supporter Logan. You talk about new Chinese icebreakers. Do you know how many are in the US inventory? So Logan is asking that in response to a recent episode about China's plan to screw over Russia. That was one of my favorite thumbnails, by the way. And as I mentioned, Russia and China are competing for influence in the Arctic. The US is also an Arctic nation because of Alaska. But the US is far from having a dominating presence there because the US can barely even get around the Arctic. You know how many icebreaker ships the US has? 2! America has more Batmen than we do icebreaker ships, which is especially sad since 2 of these aren't even American. Meanwhile, Russia and China are building nuclear-powered icebreakers. Of course, maybe the plan is to just let China and Russia duke, or nuke it out, and step in when they both severely weakened each other. Of course, by then, we might be living in the Fallout universe. Thank you for your question and your longtime support, Logan. Speaking of Fallout, did you know I have a new gaming channel? I'm using gaming as a cover to talk about controversial or thought-provoking topics YouTube might otherwise censor. The latest is about what Carl Jung called the shadow, hiding it in a video about Monster Hunter. Check it out and let me know what you think. And click on that orange button to be like Logan and support China Uncensored on Patreon. We can't afford to make the show without you. All it takes is a couple of bucks a month. Once again, I'm Chris Chappell. See you next time.